Hello and welcome. I'm Fernando, a GP in the UK. Today we will go through the NICE guideline on celiac disease, assessment and management, or NG20, focusing on what is relevant in primary care only. Right, let's jump into it. And before we start on the guideline itself, what is celiac disease exactly? Celiac disease is a genetic, immune-mediated enteropathy triggered by gluten in some people. It primarily affects the small intestine, leading to villous atrophy, crypt hyperplasia, and malabsorption. Why does it happen? Well, the pathophysiology is as follows. Gluten, specifically gliadin, is found in wheat, barley, and rye. An enzyme called tissue transglutaminase modifies gluten peptides. In genetically predisposed people, these modified peptides are presented to T cells, triggering an inappropriate immune response. This leads to inflammation and damage to the small intestinal mucosa, particularly in the proximal small bowel. We should suspect celiac disease and offer serological testing if there is persistent and explained abdominal or gastrointestinal symptoms, fatigue or weight loss, mouth ulcers, unexplained iron, vitamin B12 or folate deficiency, first-degree relatives affected, conditions such as type 1 diabetes, autoimmune thyroid disease, and irritable bowel syndrome. And we should also consider testing in a number of other conditions, for example, reduced bone mineral density, unexplained neurological symptoms like peripheral neuropathy or ataxia, persistently raised liver enzymes, and Downs and Turner syndromes. However, before arranging any investigations, we will need to explain that any test is accurate only if a gluten-containing diet is eaten during the entire diagnostic process. This also means that they should not start a gluten-free diet until diagnosis is confirmed by a specialist, even if the results of a serological test are positive. Additionally, people following a normal diet should be advised to eat some gluten in more than one meal every day for at least 6 weeks before testing. If they have already restricted the gluten intake and are unable to reintroduce it, we will refer them to gastroenterology, explaining that it may be difficult to confirm their diagnosis, even by intestinal biopsy. People who have tested negative for celiac disease should be retested if new suggestive symptoms arise or persist, particularly if they have type 1 diabetes or a family history. What serological testing should we do for celiac disease? NICE recommends that the first choice of test should be immunoglobulin A tissue transglutaminase antibodies, together with total immunoglobulin A to exclude deficiency. But why is this? Let's remember that everyone has the tissue transglutaminase enzyme. However, in people with celiac disease, the immune system produces autoantibodies against this enzyme, particularly IgA autoantibodies. This autoantibody response is highly specific to celiac disease, triggered by gluten exposure in genetically susceptible people, and correlate with intestinal damage. That is, the higher the autoantibodies, the more likely there is villous atrophy. This is why serum IgA tissue transglutaminase antibodies are the first-line screening test. It's convenient, non-invasive, and has high sensitivity and specificity, especially in untreated people. Additionally, in adults, the lab should test for immunoglobulin A endomysial antibodies if immunoglobulin A tissue transglutaminase antibodies are weakly positive, and consider additional tests if immunoglobulin A levels are low. Then the lab should clearly communicate the interpretation of the results as well as the recommended action. We should then refer anybody with positive serological test results to a gastrointestinal specialist for further assessment, which for adults will most likely include endoscopic intestinal biopsy. We should also refer those with negative serological test results if celiac disease is still clinically suspected. People diagnosed with celiac disease should have an annual review in order to measure weight and height, review symptoms and diet, and consider the need for specialist dietetic advice. For those who have persistent symptoms despite gluten exclusion, we should review the certainty of the original diagnosis, refer them to a specialist dietitian to investigate continued exposure to gluten, and investigate potential complications or coexisting conditions such as irritable bowel syndrome, lactose intolerance, bacterial overgrowth, or colitis. If no other cause is found, we will call it refractory celiac disease, and we will need to refer them and consider prednisolone while waiting for specialist advice. We should give people with celiac disease sources of information on the disease, including, for example, specialist groups and dietitians, how to manage social situations like eating out and traveling, avoiding cross-contamination at home, and immunization against pneumococcus. All of this being aware that people with celiac disease may experience anxiety and depression. In terms of dietary management, they should seek advice before taking over-the-counter vitamin or mineral supplements, explaining that they may need to take specific supplements, such as calcium or vitamin D, if the dietary intake is insufficient. We can also explain that they can choose to include gluten-free oats in the diet at any stage, and continuing them will depend on their response after starting their consumption. So that is it, a review of the NICE guideline on celiac disease. We have come to the end of this episode. Remember that this is not medical advice, but only my summary and my interpretation of the guidelines. You must always use your clinical judgment. Thank you for watching, and goodbye.